I have to say this plainly, because the moment deserves plain language. I have rarely seen a modern war machine lean so heavily on something so cheap, so crude, and so deceptively effective. Plywood, styrofoam, off-the-shelf electronics, a flying contradiction. And yet, for Vladimir Putin, this was supposed to be the solution. This was supposed to be the answer to a war he could not win on the ground. Because when your tanks stall, when your infantry bleeds, when your generals lie to you, you look for something that can fly over the mess. You look for distance. You look for terror without consequence. You look for drones. And for a long time, Putin thought he had found his perfect weapon. Wave after wave, night after night, hundreds launched week after week. Not to win territory, not to achieve decisive breakthroughs, but to exhaust, to frighten, to freeze cities in the dark, and convince civilians that resistance is futile. That was the strategy. Cheap weapons, endless supply, permanent pressure. But every machine, no matter how large, has a switch. And on January 13th, Ukraine flipped it. Let's be clear about the context, because context is what propaganda tries to erase. Russia's ground war has failed. That is not opinion. That is observable reality. Despite years of fighting, despite catastrophic losses, despite the constant theater of televised bravado, Russian forces have made painfully little progress. So little, in fact, that officials have repeatedly been caught claiming the capture of cities that remain firmly under Ukrainian control. Not contested, not disputed, controlled. So when the ground war stalled, the narrative shifted. Missiles, drones, long-range terror as a substitute for battlefield success. If you cannot advance, you punish. If you cannot win, you exhaust. That became the doctrine. And it almost worked. Ukrainian cities absorbed blow after blow. Energy infrastructure was targeted during winter. Civilian neighborhoods were hit not because of military value, but because of psychological value. The message was simple: we can keep doing this forever. But that belief rested on one fragile assumption: that production would never stop. On January 13th, Ukraine shattered that assumption. Overnight, deep inside Russian territory, in Taganrog in the Rostov Oblast, something very specific happened. Ukraine did not strike a random warehouse. It did not hit symbolic targets for headlines. It went straight for the heart. The place where drones are born. The place where designs become assembly lines. The place where Putin's cheap terror was manufactured at scale. The strike was immediate, violent, impossible to hide. A massive fire erupted. Witnesses reported repeated explosions. Not the sound of debris, not the sound of accidents, but the unmistakable rhythm of stored components and ammunition cooking off one after another. This was not disruption. This was destruction. According to official statements from Ukraine's Security Service, the SBU, the Alpha Special Operations Center coordinated with units from the Ukrainian Navy. That detail matters. This was not improvisation. This was planning, precision, a deliberate choice of target and method. They hit the production buildings of the Atlant Aero facility, a site sitting comfortably inside Russia, far from the front lines, long assumed to be safe. And that assumption burned along with the buildings. The importance of this facility cannot be overstated. Atlant was not a factory, it was the factory, handling the entire drone production cycle for the Russian military. Design, assembly, testing, integration. From start to finish, from concept to launch. And this is where the narrative shifts from spectacle to strategy. Because this war is not just about who fires more weapons, it is about who can replace them. Every destroyed tank that cannot be rebuilt weakens an army. Every drone that never leaves a factory saves lives on the other side of the border. Ukraine understands this. Russia, until now, pretended it did not matter. But it matters. It always mattered. Ukraine has been methodically dismantling Russia's logistics and production networks ever since it gained the ability to strike deep into Russian territory. Fuel depots, ammunition storage, repair facilities, and now drone manufacturing itself. Each strike is a subtraction problem. Fewer systems, fewer options, fewer nights of terror. And that brings us to the human contrast at the center of this war. On one side, you have a Kremlin leadership that treats civilians as pressure points, Ukrainian families as leverage, infrastructure as a weapon. The goal is not victory. The goal is submission through exhaustion. On the other side, you have a country fighting for survival, choosing targets not for revenge, but for effect. Not cities, not apartment blocks, factories, workshops, testing labs, the places that make terror possible in the first place. This is not a symmetrical conflict. It never was. Putin relies on numbers. Ukraine relies on precision. Putin relies on repetition. Ukraine relies on timing. Putin relies on fear. Ukraine relies on consequence. And the people who pay the price for Putin's strategy are not generals in bunkers. They are civilians in Kharkiv, families in blackout conditions, children sleeping through air raid sirens. That is the real opposition here. Not Russia versus Ukraine, but impunity versus accountability. The January 13th strike exposed that divide with brutal clarity. Because when a factory burns, it cannot pretend. When explosions echo through a production site, denial becomes theater. And when Russian officials stand in front of cameras claiming success, while smoke rises behind them, the lie collapses under its own weight. This was not just a strike on a building. It was a strike on an illusion. The illusion that Russia could terrorize indefinitely without cost. The illusion that distance equals safety. The illusion that cheap weapons guarantee permanent leverage. Ukraine didn't argue with that illusion. It erased it. And this was only the beginning. Now let's slow this down, because this is where the real damage becomes visible. Not in flames, not in viral clips, but in consequences. This strike was not loud chaos. It was structured logic. It was a sequence. And every step tells you Ukraine knew exactly what it was doing. First, the choice of weapon matters. Ukraine did not use drones this time. That alone should make Moscow uncomfortable. Drones are familiar. Drones are deniable. Drones allow officials to hide behind phrases like debris and intercepted targets. Missiles do not grant that luxury. Missiles are blunt facts. They arrive with force that leaves no ambiguity. According to multiple reports, Ukrainian missiles struck production buildings, workshops, and critically, testing facilities at the Atlant Aero complex. That detail is easy to overlook, but it is devastating. You can rebuild walls, you can replace machines, but when you lose testing infrastructure, you lose the ability to evolve. You freeze in time. And this war is increasingly about evolution. Russia's drone campaign depends not just on quantity, but on adaptation. Electronic countermeasures, navigation resilience, guidance systems, incremental upgrades that make cheap drones harder to stop. By targeting testing sites, Ukraine didn't just slow production, it attacked the future of that production. Then there is the electronic warfare component. Reports indicate that workshops producing electronic warfare system components were also hit. These systems are essential to Russian air defense. They jam signals, they confuse guidance, they keep incoming weapons from reaching their targets. So what happens when you destroy the factories that built the shields? Air defenses weaken, detection degrades, interception rates drop. Suddenly, everything downstream becomes more vulnerable, including the factory itself. Military planners have a term for this, a double tap. You strike once to remove defenses, you strike again to finish the job. And if Atlant Aero relied on its own electronic warfare systems for protection, as many such facilities do, then the first strike may have already stripped it bare. This is not speculation, this is pattern recognition. Ukraine has demonstrated repeatedly that it targets systems, not symbols. It removes the ability to respond, then exploits the gap. Atlant now sits exposed, easier to hit, harder to defend. And every day it remains offline compounds the loss. But why dedicate valuable missile resources to this site in particular? Because Atlant Aero is not just important, it is central. According to reported information, the facility manufactures components for Orion drones, long-range systems capable of carrying guided munitions hundreds of kilometers. It also produces parts for first-person view drones and the electronic warfare systems that protect them. But most critically, Atlant appears to be a primary production site for the Molniya drone. And the Molniya deserves attention because it explains Russia's entire drone philosophy in one object. The Molniya is not elegant. It is not advanced. It looks, frankly, improvised. Wooden elements, foam construction, a design that feels closer to a workshop project than a polished weapon system. And that is exactly the point. Multiple reports suggest the Molniya is built from basic materials, plywood, styrofoam, and electronic components sourced largely from China. That simplicity makes it cheap. That cheapness makes it scalable, and scalability makes it dangerous. The payload is modest by missile standards, generally reported between 3 and 5 kilograms of explosives. On its own, that may not sound devastating, but Russia found ways to increase lethality. Some Molniya drones have reportedly been modified to carry anti-tank mines, effectively doubling their explosive yield. And again, this is not about individual power, it is about repetition. Since 2023, Molniya drones have been mass-produced and used extensively against Ukrainian cities, particularly near the front lines. Kharkiv knows this weapon well. These drones typically strike positions up to 40 kilometers behind the front, sometimes farther, enough to hit logistics, enough to hit civilians, enough to terrorize. Then came the adaptations, a so-called mother drone variant, capable of carrying smaller FPV drones mounted on its frame. The Molniya flies deep, releases its payload, and then conducts its own strike. One reported mission allegedly traveled roughly 60 kilometers before deploying secondary drones. This is cheap ingenuity weaponized. There have even been discussions within Russian media about adding automated target tracking systems, loosely described as artificial intelligence, allowing the drone to identify and follow targets via video feeds. Whether that qualifies as true AI is debatable. What is not debatable is that it would make interception harder and civilian danger greater. Ukraine noticed, and here's the part that should truly unsettle the Kremlin, Ukraine copied it, improved it, and made it cheaper. In August, Ukrainian media reported that Ukraine began producing its own version of the Molniya, known as the Bliskovka. Same basic structure, similar range and payload, but with refinements. Lower production cost, reportedly around $857 per unit. Configurable for both remote and autonomous operation, capable of carrying multiple munition types. This is strategic judo. Take your opponent's cheap weapon, remove its weaknesses, turn it back on them. So when Ukraine hit Atlant Arrow on January 13th, it wasn't guessing. It knew exactly what was being built there. It understood that Russia could always find more wood, always find more foam, always import more components, but it cannot build drones without factories. A nail is useless without a hammer. Ukraine just took away the hammer. And the evidence backs this up. Beyond official SBU statements, Russian Telegram channels confirmed the timing and intensity of the strike. Reports indicate the attack began around 5 in the morning local time. Fires, explosions, thick plumes of smoke visible from miles away. One short video circulating online shows a building at the Atlant facility fully engulfed in flames. 7 seconds is all it takes to tell the story. Even if the fire was extinguished, the structure is almost certainly gutted, machinery damaged, wiring destroyed, production halted. And that brings us to the human cost, the part that never shows up in factory diagrams. Every Molniya drone that never gets built is a drone that never flies into Ukrainian airspace, that never hits a transformer, that never explodes near a hospital, that never wakes a family at 3 in the morning with the sound of incoming death. When production stops, terror pauses. This is why Ukraine targets factories instead of cities. This is why it spends missiles on infrastructure instead of revenge, because the payoff is not measured in headlines, but in nights where people sleep. Russia's strategy treats civilians as expendable. Ukraine's strategy treats them as the point. And that is the deepest contrast of all. One side believes fear is infinite. The other understands supply chains are not. One side floods the sky. The other removes the source. The January 13th strike did not end the drone war, but it changed its math. And in war, math always wins in the end. Now widen the lens, because the fire in Taganrog was not an isolated blaze. It was one flare in a much larger pattern. A pattern Vladimir Putin has spent years insisting does not exist. January 13th was not just bad for one factory. It was a brutal night across multiple fronts. While Atlant Arrow burned, Ukraine struck elsewhere with the same cold logic. Anti-aircraft systems destroyed, radar stations eliminated, ammunition depots turned into craters. Concentrations of Russian troops hit while they slept, believing they were protected by distance and denial. This matters, because wars are not lost in one moment. They are lost when systems fail simultaneously. Ukraine's general staff confirmed the destruction of multiple Russian air defense assets, Tor systems, Tunguska platforms, radar installations. These are not decorative units. These are the eyes and shields of the battlefield. Remove them, and everything behind them becomes visible, vulnerable, targetable. And then there is Taganrog's other wound, the aircraft repair facility. The Beriev aircraft plant, another keynote in Russia's military-industrial complex, was also struck. This plant services Russian bombers and surveillance aircraft, strategic assets, irreplaceable assets. The kinds of aircraft Russia cannot simply mass-produce with plywood and foam. This facility has been hit before. In November, Ukrainian strikes reportedly destroyed experimental aircraft there, including platforms linked to airborne early warning capabilities. And that detail should chill Moscow far more than any viral fireball. Because Russia's A-50 aircraft, its airborne radar and command platforms, are already scarce. Multiple reports have suggested Russia entered 2024 with a dangerously small number remaining. Ukraine destroyed several. Others are aging. Maintenance is complex. Repairs are slow. If Russia cannot repair its A-50s, it loses vision. No vision means weaker air defense. Weaker air defense means more Ukrainian strikes get through. More strikes means more factories burn. This is not coincidence. This is compounding pressure. And this is where Putin's strategic failure becomes undeniable. He built a war model based on volume, intimidation, and attrition, assuming Ukraine would eventually crack. But attrition cuts both ways, and intimidation loses power when the intimidator bleeds infrastructure. The moral conclusion here is uncomfortable for Moscow, but simple. You cannot terrorize indefinitely without becoming structurally fragile. You cannot rely on lies while your supply chains are on fire. You cannot win a modern war by pretending production is infinite. Russia's drone campaign exposed its own weakness: centralization. Cheap weapons still need centralized assembly, centralized testing, centralized logistics, and centralized systems are vulnerable once your enemy can reach them. Ukraine now can. And the method matters just as much as the target. The use of missiles instead of drones signals something profound: confidence, stockpiles, industrial maturity. It suggests Ukraine is no longer merely responding, it is shaping the battlefield. Whether these were Neptune-class missiles, modified systems, or newly developed long-range weapons is almost beside the point. The point is this: Ukraine has options now, multiple options, and options terrify planners who built defenses for a narrower threat. Putin hoped Ukraine would remain reactive. Ukraine is now proactive, and this changes the psychology of the war. Factories inside Russia once symbolized safety. Now they symbolize exposure. Every manager, every engineer, every official involved in weapons production must now ask the same quiet question: are we next? That question slows work. It complicates logistics. It introduces fear where confidence once lived. Meanwhile, Russian propaganda continues its familiar theater. Officials speak of repelled attacks, of intercepted targets, of minor damage. They do this while smoke rises in the background, and civilian footage contradicts them in real time. This is not strength, it is habit. We have seen this before. Regimes that speak victory while infrastructure collapses are not projecting power. They are buying time, time that Ukraine is steadily taking away. And here is the part Putin likely underestimated the most. Ukraine is not striking out of rage, it is striking out of restraint. It could hit apartment blocks. It does not. It could hit symbolic landmarks. It chooses factories. It could mirror terror. It dismantles capacity. That distinction matters, morally and strategically. Because every drone factory destroyed is not just a Russian loss, it is a Ukrainian life potentially spared. Fewer attacks on power grids, fewer hospitals under threat, fewer winter nights spent in darkness wondering if the next buzzing sound is the last thing you will hear. This is why these strikes resonate beyond military analysis. They are about dignity, about refusing to let terror become normalized, about proving that cheap violence has a cost. And the cost is rising. Russia launched tens of thousands of drones over the past year. Numbers that sound impressive until you realize what they imply. A dependency so deep that losing one factory can ripple for months. When output drops, choices become harder. Which cities do you target? Which fronts do you prioritize? Which systems do you cannibalize to keep others running? Attrition, finally, begins to bite the aggressor. Ukraine's campaign against production facilities is not about winning tomorrow. It is about making continuation unbearable, making the war more expensive than Putin can politically sustain, making lies harder to tell when smoke keeps proving them wrong. This is not escalation for escalation's sake. This is consequence. And consequences are the one thing authoritarian systems are least prepared to absorb. So when you see the flames in Taganrog, do not think of them as a moment. Think of them as a message written in infrastructure, not speeches. You can build drones cheaply. You cannot rebuild trust cheaply. You can lie about progress. You cannot lie away burning factories. Ukraine is writing a new chapter in this war, one Putin hoped would never be written, a chapter where distance no longer equals safety, where production lines are as exposed as front lines, where terror has a supply chain, and that supply chain can be broken. And this is the part that lingers.